Welcome everybody. I see 90% of the audience are new to this seminar, and I would really like you to come next week and the following week because we're going to have some very exciting speakers. We are waiting for the weather to improve, so the plan is to have some very exciting speakers. So if you're really interested in forecasting on anything from a mathematical statistical perspective, you need to come more often. I know Jason is very popular in biological sciences, and I'm not going to comment further, but we need you to come next week as well. And with that said, the speaker next week is Professor Elias Bilionis from Purdue University, who is going to be talking, he told me without using any single equation, on Bayesian aspects of prediction and forecasting in general, okay? All right, so today we're excited to have Jason from Biological Science coming to join us to give a seminar. We appreciate you volunteering because it's very hard to find volunteers now at Notre Dame. So Jason I was amazed, I was reading this when I was coming. He did his bachelor's degree in geography. That was fun, I bet.
I was the last geography major. I went to South America, and when I came back, there was no department.
You mean they closed the department?
That was it, yeah.
Right.
They were like, yeah, we made it. Yeah.
You know, I know somebody else actually that did his bachelor's degree in geography. Wasn't it one of the UK, the Prince of Wales or something? You know?
Oh yeah, it's popular. They need to know like all the capitals of all the countries and things. Yeah.
So he did his master's in forest ecology at the University of Washington, PhD in biology at Duke. His research focuses on forecasting of ecosystems, accounting for environmental uncertainties, and interesting, he says, I think this is in anticipation of tough questions. He says he's primarily an empiricist, but he works well with statisticians and modelers.
Yeah.
This will not fly very well here. We consider everybody a statistician and mathematician.
Well, good. In that case, you'll see what I've got. Also, very few equations. Yeah, and actually, I would just second what Nicholas said. This group is really good, and it's just getting started, and it's bringing people together who haven't crossed across the campus before, so it really is a good idea to show up. Every one of these seminars has been really outstanding, and so I'm going to break that chain today. I wanted to, so for people on this side of the room are pretty familiar with this project, Paleyon. For those of you who don't know about it, it's just an NSF macro systems biology grant that I lead. Macro systems biology is sort of trying to scale ecosystem and population biology problems up to global scales. So it's a new NSF program. The project is big. There's over 100 people who contributed to this. I'm highlighting here pictures of a few of them with their pets. Some of these guys are statisticians. Some of them are people who are sort of used to collecting or interpreting long-term data about ecological change, and some of them run predictive models for how the biosphere is going to work. And those three groups have not talked to each other very much at all before this project got started. So a lot of it is about the kind of translations that CICS is trying to instill between disciplines. I'm just going to outline the problem here. You guys are familiar with it. A lot of times when you think about the uncertainty in terms of global warming, these are just recent IPCC projections of warming, and the difference between the map on the left and the map on the right is a difference in drivers. So this is what humans decide to do, right? How many greenhouse gases we produce, how much deforestation happens, and that's certainly really one of the major sources of uncertainty in prediction. But on top of that, there are some other forms of uncertainty that are really serious. And so this is a paper that came out a few years ago. Each of these lines is a different model of the biosphere. So this is the flux of carbon in petagrams. So that's like those are gigatons of carbon into the ocean or into the land. And each of those models was run with exactly the same drivers and exactly the same uncertainties. And you can see in the case of the oceans, there's disagreement among the models, but the overall trend is fairly robust, especially given that it's hard to model the entire, oceans of the entire planet. Over on the left is what I work on, the land surface. And I heard Mike Dietz once refer to this graph as the cornucopia of shame. The models are all calibrated up until this point, up until about 1950. So they should all do pretty well back then. And then they let them run. We have data up to about 21, up to current day. And then we project out forward, and we can't even tell whether the land surface is going to be a source or sink of carbon, and the magnitude of this is tremendous, right? So in terms of the feedbacks of the land carbon budget on climate, this is huge, right? Because if the land is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, that reduces warming, and if it's putting carbon into the atmosphere, that increases warming. And we don't know which one of these models is right. The different colors here represent different process models. Some of them are quite simple. Some of them, they include different processes, but there's not even a trend really particularly among them. So it's really hard to diagnose what's going on here, and that's the challenge. All right, so this is how one of the models works. I'm going to show you over the course of this seminar, I'm going to show you at least 4 of these different models, and they really vary in terms of complexity. This is the community land model. It's one of the bigger models. It includes a lot of processes, some of which are characterized here. Everything from a global energy budget that's scaled down to pretty complex hydrology for a global model to biogeochemistry, but also increasingly CLM, this version of CLM doesn't have dynamic vegetation in it, but the new one that they're working on, which is called CLM Fates, also includes things like mortality of trees, shifting of biomes, and things like that. And so these scales, this process is run across a huge number of scales. They all interact with each other. There's feedbacks all over the place, and they're pretty poorly parameterized for a lot of those processes. So it's a real challenge. And here's one way that we've tried to put some constraints on these things with data. So this is just a little cartoon from our grant proposal. And it imagines an ensemble of models that has, which are represented in these dots. And each of these model runs has a relationship between, say, something that we can't measure, like the carbon flux into long-term soil pools. It's a really important component that lasts a really long time. It's a big part of the carbon budget of the Earth, but there's not very much data on it. And you can imagine something that's easier to estimate, like the fraction of coniferous trees, is related to that, because if there's more conifers, they tend to decomposition rate slow, and that tends to be correlated. So this is just what's in the process model, a correlation in the process model. If you use, if you take the distribution, if you just take, sort of drop these down and make a histogram, that could be your prior belief about what the distribution of the fraction of conifers is going to be. Let's say we were running this model for some time in the past. And then you might collect some data on that, and if that's a probability distribution, you can use Bayes' rule to split the difference between them and have your posterior estimate of the coniferous part of the forest be constrained both by the what we understand about the process from the model and also from the data. And now you've got a more constrained estimate on this variable, and because there's this correlation induced between them, you can then narrow down your estimates of the unobserved latent variable. So that's one way to step forward and to use what we know about the linkages between processes to constrain our understanding. And also that, because these are process models, that might give you some things to look at, like how good is this correlation in real life? How much, it gives you ideas of things to test. So it's sort of an iterative cycle. And this approach has been used successfully for some short-term processes. So here's a very, very simple model, unlike CLM. This model is called Dalek. And it's got just a couple of pools in boxes and fluxes in those little bow ties. Basically, incoming solar radiation, gross primary productivity, that's just photosynthesis. That gets shunted into 3 different pools for leaves, stems, and roots. And those decompose at different rates. So it's really, really simple model. But you can constrain it with data. So this is a case where they're looking across a landscape, and this is reflectance data from a satellite, so just how green things were. And so that gives you a constraint on the leaf carbon pool. And so if you run Dalek over a couple of years, you get, it's hard to see here, but in gray is the model, which underpredicts. This is GPP measured locally at the site. And so it's not matching the data very well. But if you use that data assimilation approach, even though we don't have very good estimates of GPP, you can constrain them a little bit better when you constrain something like the leaf biomass, right? So it makes sense. And we have an awful lot of data about these fast processes because they're easy to measure, right? You can go out in 3 years and measure something. We've had satellites up for about 30 years. We can use those data. The problem is that there's a lot of ecological processes that take longer than a few decades, and many of the things that are going to be constraints or limitations or feedbacks in the global carbon budget will take maybe centuries to play out. These include things like forest fires changing over time, species and biome range shifts. Just imagine that the climate warms and you've got, say the temperate deciduous forests of the Northeast moving into the boreal forest. That process could take a really long time. And like I said, some of the carbon pools are also have slow turnover. So there's intermittent things, there's rare things, there's slow processes. And even when we constrain a lot of our uncertainty at fast processes, it really doesn't help you predict things over the long run. So just to drive this shameful figure home even more, this was the estimate that came out in 2006. This was the original paper by Pierre Friedlingston. And this sort of was a call to everyone. And then we said, oh, we've got to do a better job at constraining these processes. And we've got all these big modeling teams around the world. 8 years later, they reran the analysis, and it's not any better. So we're not improving in our understanding of this, and it's a problem. You guys can jump in, by the way, if you have any questions. And maybe somebody can give me a heads up if I start going long. Okay, so here's a model that is, the ED2 model was actually developed by someone who's at Notre Dame, who comes to these lectures regularly. He's not here today, but David Medvigi. And this is a nice way of thinking about some of these slower and harder to measure processes. So if you just imagine changing composition in a forest, the different colors of these lollipops are different tree, either species or functional types. There could be things like conifers. Sometimes they bin them sort of coarsely in terms of conifers and deciduous trees and things like that. But they all have those different plant traits. They have the usual carbon and hydrologic and energy balance things that you've seen in earlier models. But they also do, in ED, they do a nice job with this. They have this nice approximation of some of the stochastic things that happen at an individual level. So there's about 3 trillion trees on the planet. You can't model them all. And this is a nice way of sort of capturing the first moment of those things. And so this is a model that we really like. But each of the models have their pros and cons. And we like to look at all of them because we don't really know, because they're all going to tell you something else useful, and we don't want to get too narrow in terms of our choice of process model. So here's the approach that we take in just sort of an outline. we've got, the idea in Paleyon is that we're going to model the last couple of thousand years of how the planet works. We're focusing on places where we have a lot of data, like the U.S. So the idea of going back in time is that you can actually make a forecast and see how well you did, and it allows you to sort of constrain some of these slower processes, longer term processes. So we drive the models. There's a lot of these models, like ED, will include, and CLM, include a whole lot of detail about climate. So it matters in terms of photosynthesis and carbon fixation what the humidity was, right? And it matters what the time between storms is and things like that. Those are things you're never going to get really good long-term data on in the past. There are also things that are pretty hard to predict out in the future, right? So some things are fairly robust to both estimate in the past and to predict in the future. Those would be things like mean annual temperature. But a lot of the biological processes that we're talking about don't respond very directly to mean annual temperature. So there's a lot of higher order things that drive the models. We can get all of those things from global circulation models that have been run for this time period, but those are not data, those are models, right? They're nice, they're cool models that estimate how the whole atmosphere, ocean, and land work together, but it's a simulation. So the idea is to weight those, an ensemble of those GCM outputs with some Bayesian estimates of paleoclimate, and therefore try to sort of choose the ensemble members that are more consistent with what we see in real life. And then the first thing we do is we compare those runs to what we see from empirical statistical estimates of state variables. And these are everything from the composition of forests, the distribution of those different tree types, to the overall parts of the carbon budget, like the overall biomass or productivity, and also things like disturbance frequencies, like forest fire frequencies. So we've got, so our team makes a bunch of estimates of those state variables. And so the first thing you do is you run the models and just see how they compare, and they do terrible, right? So when you try to reconstruct the last couple of thousand years, it doesn't look anything like what happened in the real world. And we sort of expected that. You can learn some stuff from it. I mean, I don't want to dismiss these models. They're pretty sophisticated, and like I said, it's a pretty big challenge just to come up with a simulation model that captures all this stuff correctly. But using that same Bayesian approach, data assimilation approach that we talk, you can make joint inference and constrain the runs of the model that are more consistent with the statistical estimates of the data, and therefore you can come up with a narrower subset of those model runs that are consistent with what really happened. And if you can constrain them in a bunch of ways, you can see a couple of things. A, you can reduce the uncertainty in terms of parameter space. You can also see what which sort of covariances occur in the models that are actually useful for you. And seem to match what happened in reality, and so that's the overall structure of the project. And I'm just going to talk through a couple of quick, at sort of a pretty high level, just a couple of the things that we've estimated statistically, so to show you how we do that, and then I'll give you some preliminary results of the from the data analysis. That or data assimilation product. This is all pretty new, and it's still in progress. So, and then I, as a treat for you guys, I inspired by Alexandra's talk, I asked the guys on my team I said, hey, this seems like a cool thing to do. Maybe we should be emulating some of these high dimensional models, and we could learn from that. And my last slide has their response, which I think was really interesting. They were overall enthusiastic, but I think that there's like these sort of epistemological differences, or just sort of language differences in how we talk about stuff. So I think that would maybe be a good start for some conversation with you guys to sort of think about how we put these pieces together. Okay, so just running through what this current state of affairs is, it's hard to know what the climate of the planet was like over several thousand years, because thermometers are not that old, and we haven't had people measuring stuff for a long time. We do have these model runs, and so these are 6 lakes that we have done downscaling of GCM model runs, and so this is simulated data. This is just growing season temperature. We can downscale any parameter we want from the GCMs, but those aren't really data. There have been, there's a history for in paleoclimatology going back a long time of people trying to reconstruct these things from proxies, and this is sort of a famous one. This is Michael Mann's reconstruction of, I think, northern hemisphere temperature over the last 1,000 years. This is part of the argument about global warming, which is just if you take like a whole set of proxy data, this is things like tree rings, borehole temperature measurements, a whole bunch of things that are scattered around the northern hemisphere, and they just use sort of z-scores to estimate the annual change, and they put a smoother on that, and you can see that 20th century is much warmer than any time in the past. So this is part of the general argument, sort of evidence for the fact that we're warming the planet. But those estimates of northern hemisphere temperature are not really, there's uncertainty on them, but they're not really the predictive uncertainty that you'd really want. And so we found, when we had the idea when we started this project that there was a whole lot of paleoclimate estimates that had uncertainty on them that we could use to constrain the models, and that turned out not to be true, almost always not to be true. So we ended up having to estimate these things in a couple different ways. I'll just show you one quick example that I just that's just gone out to review at the Annals of Applied Statistics. John Tipton developed this at Colorado State. Actually, now he's at Arkansas, I guess. And this is there's a common data source that is pretty reliable and found in any place that has natural lakes, and that's just the deposition of different pollen types into lake sediment. So every year when the pollen flies around in the spring, some of it lands in the lake, it sinks to the bottom, and you can go take a sediment core, and the pollen types are very resistant to decay, and these are basically count data. So you have you might count 400 of them, and they're proportions of the different trees that were there. And so this is a typical way that pollen diagram is shown. Paleoecologists always have time going back down because that's how the lake core is. I think it's nobody else has time going up. But paleoecologists do that because it makes sense to them, because when they get farther down the sediments, they're older. So that's why this convention exists. And this is spruce, right? So spruce trees are where it's cold. This is the end of the ice age. Then you get some really unusual assemblages of things that aren't found on the modern landscape, these combinations of funny oak ash forests. And then at this particular site in Illinois, you eventually get things like grasses and things that grow in prairies, so you could get a sense that things are warming up and getting drier here. And there's, these data exist from hundreds of places around the world, and even, what's our data set now, like a couple hundred, even just from the upper Midwest. So pretty useful kind of data, an indirect estimate of temperature. This is actually, you probably can't see this at all, because I can barely see it up close to it, but these are just the different abundances, composition of pollen types taken from the upper sediments in places related to July temperature, and it's really noisy. I guess that's an easy thing to say. There is some trends in there, but it's a hard thing to estimate. To make things more difficult, we want to do an inverse model here. We want to estimate the process from the data. So people use, say, Gaussian process models to if you might say there's some temperature drivers and these things make different amounts of trees there. In this case, we have the amounts of trees and we want to estimate the process as well as the all the we want to estimate all these covariates, temperature, precipitation, et cetera, and we want to know what's the relationship between temperature and these trees. The last point is important because we're not just interested in prediction here. The easiest thing is the most important probably thing is to have like a good estimate of what the temperature was. But actually, as an ecologist and as a biologist, I would actually like to know a lot about the relationship between these different taxa and the climate, because when I worry about how the climate change is going to happen in the future, I think about these different species like their niches, becoming more abundant or less abundant. And A, as a biologist, that's what I study, and B, it's really nice to understand that process and that relationship, because that way when you see, you'll have a sense directly and sort of more mechanistically of how changes in climate actually drive the changes in the trees. So we want to estimate both of those things, and that's why John picked this approach. It's tricky to do this inverse thing, so John's very proud of this. There's a predictive process approximation that he does in the paper. I'll just leave it to you guys when it comes out in the Annals of Applied Statistics to check through that. So he addresses a computational problem by reducing the dimensionality of the problem, and the results are pretty good. This is just 25 held out observations and what the prediction was. They all generally they do pretty well, and the posterior fit of temperature as a function. These are the taxa that went in there. This is birch trees, hemlock, sort of familiar trees, some of other conifers, stuff like that. Things like prairie herbs, and you can see that their relationship to temperature is pretty good, and it's pretty well constrained, and it's a whole, we have nice posterior estimate of all this stuff. In addition to that, you can look at the correlations between taxa, and this can tell us some things about, sort of trade-offs in the ecology of these species that's really useful for me as someone who is interested in the plants themselves and how they might respond to climate. So that's a good way to estimate climate. We've done other things. We have joint estimate. So often these paleoproxy estimates measure things that are sort of a combination of the driver variables that we need. So like almost everything in the paleo world is related to something like drought or moisture balance or precipitation minus evaporation or something like that that's a mixture of temperature and precipitation. And for a paleoecologist, it might be useful to just reconstruct dryness back in time. But the thing is that these models, the biological models, temperature works really, really differently than precipitation and moisture in terms of how plants work and how photosynthesis works and the physiology of the organisms that are the basis of these models. So we can't use an estimate of some joint thing like temperature and precipitation mixed together. We have to separate them off. And so John and Mevin Houghton at Colorado State have made joint estimates of temperature and precipitation from networks of tree rings. Similarly to the composition data that you just saw, these things are multivariate, so there's a whole bunch of different taxa, and each of the trees sort of responds to mixtures of temperature and precipitation differently, so they were able to pull those things apart a little bit. Ultimately, the tree rings gave a pretty well constrained estimate of moisture going back in time and a really terrible reconstruction of temperature. There was basically no information left on temperature after that, so we learned something about that. There's some more obscure proxies. I know there's people in this room who work on even more obscure things, but amoebas live in bogs, and different species of amoebas care about the water depth in the sphagnum, like underneath the sphagnum a lot. And so different compositions of amoebas can tell you about how moist the bog is. And then we're working on taking a bunch of these different proxy reconstructions, right? All this stuff is pretty noisy, right? If you're trying to reconstruct your climate based on amoebas that live in bogs, you're really scratching the bottom of the barrel. I mean, it's good, it's cool. Like, I say that with all respect to paleoecologists, I'm one myself, but it's amazing that we have any information about what the climate was like 2,000 years ago. And the point here is to estimate all that stuff with uncertainty and to estimate it in as many ways as you can so that some joint inference might be able to leverage information from one thing versus the other. So that's how so those are all the things that we've done to estimate temperature. Now I'll give you an example of one of the state variables. And again, I've used that same pollen diagram because we're going to use the same data this time to estimate the abundance of trees. And you might think, well, that's pretty easy because you have these estimates for pollen of the actual individual taxa. So that must tell you something fairly direct about the abundance of those trees. And that's true, but it's also a very noisy process, right? The difference in the model, we have the abundance of individual, they could be tree taxa, like spruce trees, or they could be, often in the models, they're sort of aggregated up to plant functional types, so it could be like conifers or deciduous trees or something. And those are, we want a number of trees on the grid, a gridded estimate with uncertainty on the landscape, and there's an awful lot of noise that comes into this process. For instance, so here's the thing we're interested in, is a space-time estimate of changing vegetation with uncertainty. We have pollen counts. Those have to get, there has to be a relationship between those and the vegetation. The vegetation, we can't use the modern vegetation because we mess it up too bad in the last couple hundred years. And so most of the relationship on the modern landscape between pollen in lakes and trees on the landscape is very affected by the fact around here, for instance, that we have an awful lot of corn and soybean fields that didn't exist before. So we have to use historical estimates of from surveys, from vegetation surveys from before your sort of American settlement of the country and land use. Then we estimate this relationship. We've also got identification error in the pollen counts, dating uncertainty in the way we date the sediments, and importantly, there's transport. The pollen blows really far, so you can find pollen from like beech trees in Greenland, which they don't live anywhere near Greenland. So there's a long dispersal process that you have to measure independently from the relationship between pollen and vegetation, and then you have to have some sort of spatiotemporal mapping. This is all the stuff that we do forward from that process. So this is something I started working on long ago with a guy named Chris Pachorik, who is a statistician at Berkeley. And basically, we just estimated, we calibrated this relationship between trees and pollen with these historical data and also on the modern landscape. And then we just applied that back farther in time. So in the estimation phase, when we're calibrating these things, we include all these variance components, and then we fix them when we go back in time and we don't have any kind of empirical estimates of vegetation. Andrea Dawson has picked up on that and estimated these relationships for all the upper Midwest. So here's a familiar map of our nearby states. This is the estimate at the time of settlement of vegetation for a bunch of different trees: beech trees, birch trees, maples, oaks, and pines. These are the pollen data. There's actually quite a few of them here. The coverage isn't perfect because there's some places with no lakes. But overall, you can get a pretty good estimate of their abundance. This is the calibration period. It's smooth, and it matters somewhat what you use as your dispersal kernel. So whether there's a Gaussian kernel, and a power law kernel. The power law kernel has a longer tail, and that turns out to fit the data better, which is consistent with what we think about. A lot of dispersal processes have fatter tails than exponential, so those fit a little bit better. And overall, we have the black dots are our relationship. The red dots are before, the red crosses are before we did it. You can see some of the relationships are really terrible. After we make these adjustments, we overall have things lining up on the one-to-one line. Some of them are pretty narrow, and we have more confidence about them. Some of them are positive, but they're noisier, and that's because a tree like pine trees, their pollen blows very far, and they produce a lot of pollen, and it's harder to estimate. But it doesn't matter because we have uncertainty on everything, and we can propagate that through. So what does it tell us? Here's a good test case. This is American chestnut. Here are some guys posing with American chestnuts that they found very impressive. This is an old picture because chestnuts don't look like that anymore on the modern landscape. Around 100 years ago, a blight came through and killed almost all the chestnuts in the New World. They occasionally sprout up, but the blight is still there, so they die before they get bigger than about that big around. And so this is a tree that's ecology we don't really understand very well. So it's a nice test case to sort of see what we can learn about this tree. So I'm going to show you first based on this, based on the model that I just described, what we can learn about the ecology of this species. And then I'm going to constrain one of these process models and see whether we can learn anything about about this from a more mechanistic perspective. So this is just, I'm just going to have a couple of results slides here to entertain the ecologists. Here are estimates of the amount of hemlock. This is Western Massachusetts. That little dot is Harvard Forest, where I used to work and where I gave this talk originally. So this is 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, et cetera, up to 500 years ago. You'll note that hemlock, distribution of hemlock, the abundance of hemlock, fits almost like a puzzle piece into the abundance of oak trees, and this is sort of well known among forest ecologists. Hemlock's a species that likes it a little cooler and moister. Oak likes things a little warmer and drier, and around just through this sort of curvy boundary across Massachusetts, you basically have a major division in forest types, and Harvard Forest happens to be right at the boundary of that. So originally, back in the, from 3,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago, hemlock was increasing, oak was decreasing, and then there was a shift. Hemlock increased, and oak decreased. And so you can imagine a sort of consistent climate signal driving this sort of boundary between the two taxa back and forth. And that makes good sense. We can estimate these things with uncertainty. So here's just the abundance of the two species changing over time. They're inversely correlated, and they're pretty nicely correlated. So if you get more hemlock, you get less oak at Harvard Forest, which is right on that boundary, and everything makes sense. So we learned, but we already knew about these species. What about chestnut? Chestnut has a weird story because almost all the taxa in North America arrived in the Northeast fairly soon after the last ice age. So say by like 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, they were all up there and they were all doing their thing. And for some reason that no one understands, chestnut arrived in the East very late. So here's a figure from the 80s of Margaret Davis, sort of one of the first people to synthesize all the data from the US. And she has, chestnut just arriving in New England around 2,000 years ago. And we don't know why it was so slow to arrive. But that's one of the mysteries of it, right? It doesn't seem to, it has sort of its own history. Now that we have the statistical model, we can add chestnut into the mix. And the way that chestnut spread across this area is really different. Here, it was just like a focal population started to spread, and then every 500 years, there was more of it, and it just kept increasing over time, like sort of a diffusive, if you imagine a process of just something, sort of growing and diffusing over space. That's sort of what it looks like. Not really tied to any of the big climate gradients. So if you compare Hemlock to Chestnut, Hemlock's got this sort of hump-shaped distribution that we think is driven by climate, and Chestnut just keeps increasing over time. So Chestnut isn't playing by the same rules that other taxa were playing by. And this is the kind of thing, this is fairly narrow stuff, right? Individual, some weird extinct tree in North America. But when you think about how biomes shift and how the carbon cycle of the Earth changes, this is often the kind of stuff you have to know. You have to know how closely individual taxa are responding to climate. You have to know if there's weird population processes that take thousands of years to play out. Because if it takes thousands of years for forests to shift just demographically as some species comes in and shifts, that's gonna make it very hard to to predict very carefully what's going to happen to the carbon budget. Or if you wanted to manage a tree like Chestnut. All right, so the last part of the talk, we've talked about how we estimated the climate drivers. We talked about how we estimated some of the state variables. And now I'm going to give you a current update in terms of where we are in terms of the data assimilation and sort of propagating this uncertainty through. Here's the last of the models that I'm going to talk about. Again, this is a really simple one. It works quite differently than Dalek, though. This simulates individual trees. This is an old model. It was first written in 1985, but actually people still use it. And it's actually the basis of a lot of more sophisticated models. And this thing just says the demographic traits of a species, how much it reproduces, how fast it grows, what's its mortality, is a function of environmental variables like temperature and moisture and nitrogen, which is available through decomposition. And those things constrain individual taxa and these rates, demographic rates. So this is a really different model from the one we've used. This is our sandbox because some of these other models, like the whole community Earth system model, has something like 800,000 lines of code, and it's kind of a bear to run. And even Ed, which we love, I think how long does it take to do the long runs? Like a couple months, right? Yeah. So this model has 2,000 lines of code and runs in less than a second? Yeah. So it's handy for us to try these things out. And we're interested in the demography of these species. I just raised a bunch of questions for Chestnut. So let's see what happens with Chestnut. Ann and I went back and forth on this slide because we use different software and she couldn't send me the slide. And she had this thing circled. And I was like, no, I want a version without it circled. So we spent all weekend sending like different versions of this in Keynote and stuff. And finally, I ended up circling it anyway. So sorry, Ann. It was a good use of her weekend. This is correlation between the abundance of these different taxa in the model before we use the data to constrain them. And you can see the model naively, in the naive parameterization without any constraints by data, thinks that Chestnut is sort of like an oak. It sort of co-varies with oaks, and it's unlike a hemlock. And actually, this is what I probably would have said too about Chestnut, because it's related to oaks. It tends to be more in southern places where oaks are, and this is sort of what you would think, just given what you know about the vague things we know about a species that we can't measure much on. So then we do data assimilation, and this is sort of how we think about it in our group. This is very strongly influenced by Mike Dietz, who's at BU, who would be a really good CICS speaker. And he runs this thing called Pecan, which is the tool that we use for doing our data assimilation and our uncertainty quantification. So essentially, there's a data assimilation part of it, and then the variance decomposition is sort of a sensitivity analysis, and that's done using, I guess it's like a one-at-a-time spline approximation. So it's not the most sophisticated kind of emulator you could have for doing the sensitivity analysis, but it does sort of capture some of the big parts of the model. The thing we really like about this is that it's an integrated framework for running all of these models together. So we're busy. Anne, I keep mentioning Anne. Anne's over here. She's been a big part of this. She's working hard with Mike to get develop the state data assimilation, which I'm going to show you. We're working on parameter data assimilation in the project, and so it's a nice framework that allows us to run a whole set of models of different complexity and has sort of the same architecture for doing the uncertainty analysis. So it's handy. Just the particular brand of data assimilation that we use is a generalized. We use an ensemble Kalman filter. Basically, we were having we're just predicting the next step, so it sort of goes iteratively, this was essentially, I think the reason why we picked this one is that we had filter convergence with some of the other approaches that we used. There was computational problems in terms of the particle filter, and so this is something that worked for us in terms of the state data assimilation. But it'd be interesting to talk about alternatives. But it sort of works pretty well. So the idea here, for those of you guys who haven't thought about data assimilation, I'll just mention it again. Got a state variable, you make a prediction going forward, so that's your forecast. This might be a model that says this is X, could be the amount of chestnut or something. In the future, your prediction might have more uncertainty in it. You've got some data. This could come from the pollen data, and then you use the Bayesian rule to estimate an improved estimate of this that's basically that takes advantage of the pattern in the data, but the mechanisms in the model. Before we did that, linkages in blue has no idea how much chestnut there could be. We could have picked other taxa where there's just anything from 0 to 100% of it, right? So linkages was pretty sure that there was less than 25% chestnut, but after that, didn't really know. In reality, you can't see behind here, but the data is much more constrained. And then after you go through with the analysis step, we constrain the amount of chestnut to be consistent with the data. There was a real question here, which I think is sort of interesting from a statistical point of view, about how much information there is in each of these data. So we only have estimates every 100 years from the pollen data, which is actually sort of high resolution for fossil pollen data. So we can't tell you from data how much chestnut there was every year. When we spread the information from that centennial update across every year, and said, well, we're just going to divide it by 100 and say it meant the model then linkages said, well, there's not very much information coming from the data. And I think it's a really legitimate question how much information comes from the data, right? Having some information from the real world about how much chestnut there is really important. Counting 400 pollen grains and telling how much, I'm not really sure how much information that is. In this case, Anne just did the update every 100 years, and so that's what we're looking at now. This is the process error covariance matrix. So this isn't the correlation between the taxa, but this is how much the data are suggesting that prediction, which direction it needs to go. And it says, actually, chestnut's a lot more like hemlock than you think, and even more like oak than you think. So the data are saying that we've sort of mischaracterized how these species, the ecology of these species. And if you look across, so this is, I guess, about 500 years of simulation, and these are some of the state variables in the model. This is stem density, and over here is biomass, so maybe how big the trees are, so slightly different indexes of how big the trees are. And you can see that for hemlock, the model is always, the data are always trying to pull that amount down a little bit. For oak, it's trying to increase every time there's a data assimilation step. It's trying to it wants to pull the amount of oak up, and linkages kills chestnut. It just it wants to kill the chestnut, and every 100 years when you get data in there, the model's like, oh, you pick the ensembles that had some chestnut in there, and then linkages kills them right away. So clearly the model's not capturing this very well, and so right now we're at the cusp of having some parameter data assimilation, and one of the parameters that we expect will get changed by having the data is the mortality function. Clearly, Chestnut can do better in New England than the naive parameterization of the model says, and so some data will tell us that, and then we'll actually have information about how the improved understanding of the demography of this extinct species. All right, a couple more slides. This is just the point that when we tried to estimate, when we applied this, when we pushed this into an unmeasured variable, this is soil carbon, it basically didn't change that much. So I think we didn't have a very strong correlation between these taxa and this particular state variable in the model. But when we start linkages does do carbon budget and things, so it should improve those things. In the long run, we should get constraints on those, and especially when we start using all the other models together. Overall, I said I would, this is just a picture I took with my crappy phone at the last time we were together drinking beer. These are some of the team members, and I just said, I was so impressed with this talk, and I said, shouldn't we be doing this? And they said interesting things. So everybody was enthusiastic, and you can see a little bit of skepticism, and you can see some defensiveness. Somebody was like, oh, well, we should definitely do it in pecan. And some people said, oh, the big models are too complicated. We tried this, it didn't really work out very well. But I think one of the other things that you see here, which is also probably a little bit of a disciplinary difference, is that because most of the people on this project are biologists, they basically said, if it's one thing to improve the prediction and to help reduce the uncertainty. That's obviously a good thing. But if we can use this, if we can come up with, say, low-dimensional versions of these models and learn from them, what we're really interested in is learning about the process, right? So you don't want to just black box all the processes in here. You have to. We'd be interested in doing this. These guys would be more interested in doing it if you could think a little bit about these sort of ecological processes that are driving it. So I think that would be food for thought. I think I'm close to running out of time, so I'll just say thanks, and maybe we have a few minutes for questions.
Questions from the audience?
Half the people on this side of the room could have given this talk, so
That's another reason for them to ask questions.
Yeah.
Did you give a good presentation?
Yep.
She has to say yes. Oh, Nicholas.
One of the difficult things with dynamical systems, right,
Yeah.
is every time, so you have uncertainty in the model,
Right.
and you try to do predictions in the future, and whatever you do, uncertainty will grow.
Yeah.
It's inherent. Unless you collect new data and you start with a new model every 100 years.
Right. Yeah, so I think that it would be appropriate for the uncertainty to grow into actual forecasts of the future. And frankly, one of the reasons why we're doing this is because I would say still most of the forecasts of ecosystem state going forward don't really have a proper accounting of uncertainty. So if you look at say the IPCC projections, they include some uncertainty. They include ensemble variation between models, but they definitely don't include all sorts of process uncertainty. They don't include parameter uncertainty. There's a whole bunch of things. So I think those, even though there is like sort of a cone and uncertainty going forward in those models, I think it really underestimates what we really know. The idea of this stuff, doing these hindcasts where you predict stuff that you already know, is that you can help like, assess the prediction, validate it as you go forward, and maybe you can start improving the models because you can see where things go. That's the ultimate idea. But I agree, we definitely, we don't know the future. But I would rather have our models of the future, most of the uncertainty be like driver uncertainty in terms of, let's say, what humans do with fossil fuel building, and less of it be, that uncertainty in that cone of, what do you call it, the cornucopia of shame, like that's bad uncertainty. If your models don't even agree on the sign of globally whether the land surface is going to take up carbon or emit it when they're run with exactly the same drivers, that means we don't understand enough about the process. So that's where I'd like to, I think we can improve things. But we definitely will, I don't think we'll have good estimates of the future. In some cases, I wonder how wise it is for us to, because a lot of policymakers and government officials, they want to use these estimates to help constrain management. Right? That's the reason why we make them. If we don't have a fair estimate of uncertainty going forward, we're giving them unrealistically narrow forecasts, and that's really dangerous.
I'll just add one thing to
Yep.
that. I think too is like we rarely quantify the uncertainty in the process, so it's like confounding uncertainty factors projecting into the future. Like it could be the met drivers, it could be the parameters, it could be, a lot of different things. But if we don't quantify how much uncertainty is coming from the model itself, then
Yeah. You guys got a good overview of what these models are like. They're corny as hell, right? I mean, even the really sophisticated ones don't do everything right? That's not, it's like and you can't expect a computer simulation to capture all of these processes really well. This is how the whole planet works. It's never gonna, and it's not robust. It's sensitive to weird things like how fast chestnut moves and stuff like that, right? Forest fires and really stochastic things and all these feedbacks. And so I think that we shouldn't expect the process models to be very accurate. And it's probably a good thing if we could include, if we were sort of talking to policymakers, just reiterate this fact without being ashamed of it, right? It doesn't mean the models are bad, it means the system's really complicated. But that's where I think data is really useful for constraining these things. And that's why I think the past is really useful, because we have changed the planet by 5 degrees C, and we have data on that, right? Over and over again around the world. So, people who are out there actually looking at how these things happened, that's actually a pretty good sense of what constraints we have on the planet. But you need these models to sort of give the mechanisms. Yeah?
How do you assess the quality of uncertainty?
Well, we try to partition it in ways that, and so it's kind of tricky, and I think we haven't really gotten there entirely yet.
we have with the data.
What?
We have with the data.
We have with the data, right? So we can estimate our. You mean like sort of specifically what are we using for our model fit?
How do you know that the uncertainty is good or not, or bad? Because every method can give some uncertainty.
Yes, right. So we usually use a bunch of them. So for instance, in that model where we were reconstructing temperature, the first one I showed, the first Bayesian model, John estimated model fit in a bunch of different ways, and there was some consistencies among the different approaches. And I think each of those estimates of model fit would tell you something different, right? So I wouldn't necessarily just pick one metric. They're always telling you different things. I think when you look across a bunch of them, you can see whether approach is consistent. And we calibrate everything, right? So our goal is to have all this stuff calibrated pretty well. With process uncertainty, like I said, there's a lot of stuff that often when people run a lot of these different models, they have almost like a contest to see who's the best. I don't think that's necessarily the best way to do it, because there's some value in having a diversity of models, even ones that don't actually have that strictly good of predictive capacity, because they may do some things that you're interested in, or it might be good to have an alternate perspective on things. So I'm in favor of keeping in models that don't necessarily have a very good predictive ability.
Yeah, so if there is some quantitative measure,
Yeah.
certainty, quality of answer, that would be good.
Yeah, well, we do. So usually, with the models, they do these things called Taylor diagrams, which are really hard to look at. But they measure sort of 3 different estimates of model fit in the same graph, which makes your eyes go bananas. And people who look at these things really estimate them. And there is like a best version that captures, different estimates of goodness of fit. So you can actually use those to say what quantitatively is the best model. And I think that's good, right? You could have some utility function if you're saying this is the thing I want to optimize. But I definitely think that's worth doing and can give us a sense of how to improve things. But I'm also in favor of including sort of a spectrum of different ways of thinking about stuff, even if they don't necessarily fit by whatever objective metric we use. Good? Sure. Thanks, Nicholas. Thank you, guys. This is a really good group. We should keep talking.